On a long enough timeline, the survival rate drops to zero. This is true for individuals, corporations, governments, empires, and even the almighty dollar. Nothing man-made is all-powerful, and up until its collapse, any Goliath looks unstoppable. When the end does come, they will say, "No one saw this coming." Consider yourself warned. The end of the line is coming. The dollar is the world's reserve currency that funds the military-industrial complex, that secures the world's natural resources and trading lanes, that our corporations harvest into tremendous profits, that flow through the banking centers in London and New York, that control our politics, police, and media, that then controls you. As much as you might even want to hold on to this American dream, you will wake to a very harsh post-dollar reality soon enough. There are simply too many systemic factors that will lead to the end of the dollar. Aging demographics of the baby boomers, exponentially rising debts, especially among our young, offshoring of manufacturing, misallocation of capital into consumerism, massive wealth inequality, illegal immigrants feeding off the Ponzi scheme, resource degradation like the drought in California and peak oil, blowback from decades of assassinations, coups, and wars, and the fact that 2/3 of the world today does not benefit from the current economic order and are actively working to rid themselves of the dollar heroin. All of these and much, much more assure us that the end of the line is coming soon for the dollar. Things that cannot go on forever simply won't. Do not expect the dollar to die quietly. Far too many would rather slaughter faceless people than give up their benefits, iPhones, and Whoppers. Far too much power and wealth are at stake for it to simply wither away and die.
The United States is in a perpetual state of war because the bankers control the politicians and they read the script as given to them by the banksters and they make huge amounts of money off of this.
War is coming, and as we have seen in the first 3 parts of the rise and the fall of the bankster, nothing that happens in this world happens accidentally. We fully expect the debt and death-mongering Anglo-American Empire to conduct false flag operations to bring about the right crisis.
Never waste a good crisis.
Their effort to create chaos out of order is to once again cover up the fact that we are bankrupt and run by a bunch of psychopaths.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
After successfully pulling off the false flag known as 9/11, it was widely known in the intelligence community that they were soon going to roll over all of the Middle East.
And by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that. This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Vice President Dick Cheney even plotted to have a false flag against Iran just before they left office in 2008. In the same style of the flags of the USS Maine, USS Liberty, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Cheney plotted to have U.S. servicemen killed and blame it on some enemy, namely Iran.
One of the items was, why not, there was a dozen ideas proffered, how to trigger a war. The one that interested me the most was, why don't we in our shipyard build 4 or 5 Iranian boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put Navy SEALs on them with a lot of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes to the Straits of Hormuz, start a shootout. Might cost some lives, and it was rejected because you can't have Americans killing Americans. But that's the level of stuff we were talking about, provocation.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the USS, until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why?
Israel and the United States failed to provoke Iran, so they moved on to Libya to loot their gold and oil.
We came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? I'm sure it did.
If they could not get Iran, the Anglo-American Empire would incite the moderate leader of Syria, the former ophthalmologist Bashar Assad, hoping to drag in Iran. It is widely accepted that the Anglo-American Empire was behind the rebels in Syria that have caused close to 250,000 Syrian deaths.
We have been arming people directly who are Al-Qaeda. Al-Nusra Front is Al-Qaeda. These people are psychopaths to the worst order. They are conducting suicide attacks. They are gassing people. We know, Carla Del Ponte said in May that it was the so-called rebels in Syria that were using sarin gas, not the Bashar al-Assad regime. No, it was not.
They even blamed a chemical weapon attack that killed 1,000 Syrians on the Assad government, despite the UN evidence that it was the United States-backed rebels that were most likely the villains. After Putin successfully ended the Syrian crisis last year, the Anglo-American Empire sought to create crisis in Russia's backyard, the Ukraine. The Ukraine was the backyard of Russia, considered vital to Russia's interests and her security. She was a nation not to be touched by NATO. The United States fomented a fake revolution and put in their puppet Yatsenuk, as evidenced by the State Department's own Victoria Nuland being caught 3 weeks before the Ukrainian Revolution plotting to
fuck the EU.
Once again, the world said no to the Anglo-American Empire as the Crimea successfully pulled away from the U.S. puppets. Even the so-called evidence that the U.S. drummed up to condemn Russia with in the airplane crash of MH17 was weaker than the quote-unquote evidence they had in the Syrian chemical false flag. But it did distract from Israel slaughtering thousands of Palestinians.
Think about when you put your children to bed at night. This is something I think about on a daily basis. You put your children to bed at night and you expect to see them in the morning. That's a luxury that people in Gaza just do not have. So what would it be like for you, living under those circumstances?
Then the United States even said that Russia had invaded the Ukraine, which also was proven false. The United States is desperately using false flag tactics in an age of internet, whistleblowers, and an increasingly aware humanity.
The historically unprecedented challenge, which is being posed in our time by a massive global political awakening, and thus is obstructing our ability to deal effectively with the global political turmoil that this awakening is generating.
Remember those Syrian freedom fighters that were fighting the Syrian government? Well, guess what? They are now ISIS, the incredible, new and improved Al-Qaeda. They have new cars. They speak perfect English.
An American citizen of your country.
They behead journalists, they have their own air force, and weapons of mass destruction. The perfect fake enemy for the largest fake empire to fight. There is no doubt in our minds that the CIA is behind this, just like the Afghan freedom fighter Zbigniew Brzezinski radicalized against the Russians and then used to blame for the fake war on terror.
We, the West, the United States in particular, Israel and Britain, are the biggest terrorists on the planet. So our little junior partners in Al-Qaeda, which is nothing more than a CIA database, thus the name Al-Qaeda, this is nothing more than a group of terrorists working together, each playing one different role, but all of them working together for the same goal, which is to maintain this hideous and sick and twisted, unjust world that we have, which is a perpetual state of war. Always one illusion, one boogeyman after another.
These English-speaking, US-trained boogeymen are using green screen theatrics with crisis actors trying to goad more highly profitable war. As you can clearly see, these psychopathic criminal elite are trying everything to start more war. They are desperate because they know that their dollar empire is crumbling, and that unless more debts are created or more resources stolen, the party stops and they will have to face their fate. 6 years after the too big to fails failed, these Anglo-American psychopaths must have a war to cover up the inevitable collapse of this cancerous economy. They must blame some external enemy for the internal rot they have caused. They must keep their system in place and you in fear. They must spread more debt and death. Reporters beheaded. 11 airliners have gone missing in Libya. Russians hijacked JP Morgan. Whatever shock comes, believe nothing they throw in your face. It is all psychological operations to get you to willingly sacrifice your blood and your money for their power and profit. Never forget that. So what now? Expect more terror. Expect more shocks to the system and more innocent people to be blamed. Expect more rush to judgment parroted by the corporate media. Expect America to fall for the flimsiest of evidence. Expect to be called a coward for not wanting more war. Expect the world to say no more war. Expect the end of the dollar. Expect bank failures. Expect stock market crashes. Expect massive unemployment. Expect suicides, murders, and riots. Expect a very harsh reality. Expect the end of the line.